19 February 1976. The front page of the News of the World carries a single grainy photograph. A woman in a swimsuit on a Caribbean beach, seated beside a young man with sun-bleached hair, a picnic table between them, and the turquoise water of Mustique behind. The woman is 45 years old. She is a married mother of 2. She is the sister of the reigning Queen of the United Kingdom. The man beside her is 28, a part-time landscape gardener, and 17 years her junior. Within 3 weeks of that picture reaching British breakfast tables, her marriage will be over in public. Within 2 years, she will be divorced. For the rest of her life, and for most of the decades after her death, she will be remembered first for this image, and only second for everything else she ever was. The British monarchy had weathered abdications, world wars, and the slow public reinvention demanded by television. It had not yet weathered a tabloid scandal of this exact shape, involving this exact woman on this exact scale. Princess Margaret was the first member of the modern royal family to behave as though the old rules no longer applied to her. She was right that those rules were changing. She was wrong that she could survive ignoring them. To understand how she arrived at that beach, in that swimsuit, beside that young man, one has to go back almost half a century, to a corner of Scotland and a child who was never meant to matter very much. She was born on August 21st, 1930, at Glamis Castle, the ancestral seat of her mother's family, the second daughter of the Duke and Duchess of York. Her elder sister Elizabeth was 4. Their father was the king's second son, a stammering, conscientious, quietly miserable man who had not expected to inherit anything in particular, and whose wife was determined that their 2 daughters should grow up out of the harsher lights of public duty. For the first 6 years of her life, Margaret was a minor royal child in a small family circle. There was no household around her. There was no obvious future. There was, in the phrase that would later be used about her with both affection and cruelty, no point to her at all. Then, in December 1936, her uncle abdicated. Edward VIII walked away from the throne to marry the twice-divorced Wallis Simpson, and Margaret's shy father almost overnight became King George VI. Her sister Elizabeth, at 10, became heir presumptive to the British Empire. Margaret, at 6, became the spare. Not the heir, not the next monarch, not the focus of any constitutional planning. Simply the second sister, with all the visibility of royalty and none of its purpose. It is the role that would shape every choice she made for the next 65 years. Inside the family, the dynamic set early. Elizabeth was dutiful, careful, watchful. Margaret was quicker, funnier, more musical, sharper-tongued. She could mimic anyone. She played the piano well enough that professional musicians took her seriously. She read voraciously. She had, by every account from those who knew the household, the more obvious natural talent of the 2 sisters, and almost nothing on which to spend it. The king made no secret of his favoritism. The family phrase, repeated until it became almost liturgical, was that Lilibet was his pride and Margaret was his joy. The joy was indulged. The joy was rarely refused. The joy was, throughout her childhood, told that she was special, charming, witty, and adored, and then sent back upstairs to a schoolroom whose curriculum had been deliberately set lower than her sister's, because nothing she learned would ever need to be used. The war years deepened the pattern. The 2 princesses were moved to Windsor and educated quietly there while London burned. Elizabeth's preparation grew more serious as the war went on. Margaret's did not. By the time she emerged into adolescence, she had absorbed completely the central contradiction of her existence. She was the most visible young woman in Britain after her sister, and she had been trained for absolutely nothing. On the morning of February 6, 1952, her father was found dead in his bed at Sandringham. He was 56. Margaret was 21. In a single morning, she lost her father, her closest ally in the family, and what little remained of her settled place in the household. Her sister, 25 years old, became Queen Elizabeth II and moved into Buckingham Palace. Margaret and her mother moved out across the road to Clarence House. The new reign had a new monarch, a new consort, a new private secretary, a new generation of courtiers, and no obvious role for a brilliant, restless, grieving princess in her early 20s. Into that vacuum stepped Group Captain Peter Townsend. He was a decorated Battle of Britain pilot, equerry to the late king, a man trusted absolutely inside the household. He was also 16 years older than Margaret, married, and the father of 2 sons. By the spring of 1952, he was, quietly, and then less quietly, in love with her. By the end of that year, he had filed for divorce from his wife, citing her adultery. In the law of the day, that made him the innocent party. But it made him, in the eyes of the Church of England, a divorced man. By the summer of 1953, the whole household knew. The country did not yet. That changed on the morning of June 2nd, 1953, in the forecourt of Westminster Abbey after the coronation of her sister. In a small, unguarded moment, the cameras caught Princess Margaret reaching up to flick a piece of lint from the lapel of Peter Townsend's uniform. It was a gesture of 2 seconds. It was the gesture of a woman who knew a man's clothes. The American press understood it immediately. The European press understood it within a day. The British press, more cautious, took a few weeks longer. And from that summer onward, Princess Margaret's private life would never be private again. That 2-second touch in the Abbey forecourt detonated slowly. The British papers held back at first, deferential by habit. But the American and continental press had no such inhibitions, and by the autumn of 1953, the story was loose in the world. The problem was not, in the end, gossip. The problem was law. Under the Royal Marriages Act of 1772, Margaret, while under the age of 25, required the formal consent of the sovereign to marry. Her sister was now that sovereign. After 25, the Act allowed her to give 12 months' notice to the Privy Council and proceed without consent, provided Parliament did not object. Townsend was divorced. The Church of England, of which Elizabeth had become supreme governor at her coronation only months earlier, did not solemnize the remarriage of divorcees while a former spouse was still living. Townsend's former wife was alive and remarried. The collision was complete. A queen who could not be seen to undermine her own church, a sister who wished to marry a man that church would not bless, and a parliament whose consent could not be assumed. The court machinery moved against the romance with quiet efficiency. Tommy Lascelles, who had served Margaret's father and now served her sister, reportedly told Townsend to his face that the relationship was, in his word, either madness or treason. The phrase has been doubted, softened, denied by some of his defenders, but the substance of his view is not in dispute. Townsend was removed from the royal household and reassigned as air attaché at the British Embassy in Brussels. It was exile costumed as promotion. Margaret was advised to wait until her 25th birthday, when, in theory, the legal constraints relaxed. She waited. Through the remainder of 1953, through 1954, through the first half of 1955, the correspondence between Brussels and London continued, much of it carried by trusted intermediaries. She turned 25 on the 21st of August 1955. Townsend returned to England that October. The press encampment outside Clarence House by then numbered in the hundreds. The political position had not softened. Sir Winston Churchill, who had been Prime Minister when the romance first surfaced, had retired in April. His successor, Anthony Eden, was himself a remarried divorcee, a fact which made the Cabinet's eventual position more awkward, not less. Eden travelled to Balmoral to put the choice to the Queen, and through her to Margaret. The terms were stark. She might marry Townsend, but to do so she would be required to renounce her rights of succession, surrender her income from the civil list, give up her royal style and title, and in all probability live abroad for a period of years. Geoffrey Fisher, Archbishop of Canterbury, was preparing the theological case against the marriage, and was reported, perhaps unfairly, to have laid out his reference books in anticipation of her visit. When she arrived at Lambeth Palace, she is said to have told him to put the books away. She had come to a decision. On the 31st of October 1955, the statement was issued from Clarence House and broadcast across the Commonwealth. It was written, by every credible account, in her own hand and her own voice. Mindful of the Church's teachings that Christian marriage is indissoluble, and conscious of her duty to the Commonwealth, she had resolved, she said, to put these considerations before any others. She would not marry Group Captain Peter Townsend. She thanked those who had prayed for her. The statement runs to a few short sentences. It is one of the most carefully constructed pieces of royal prose of the 20th century, and it ended the only chapter of her life in which she had been visibly, uncomplicatedly in love. Pause here, because this is the hinge. She was 25 years old. She had been told, in language she could not misunderstand, that the institution she had been born into would extract any price required to preserve itself, and that the price in her case was the man she wanted to marry. She complied. The compliance was public, dignified, and total. Whatever she chose to do for the rest of her life, she would choose it, knowing that obedience had cost her what disobedience could not have cost her more. The recklessness of the next 2 decades is sometimes described as a personality flaw, an indulgence, a failure of discipline. The evidence suggests something more deliberate. She had learned at 25 exactly what restraint was worth. Townsend married a young Belgian woman in 1959 who, by all accounts, resembled Margaret to an uncomfortable degree. By then, Margaret had already met the man she would marry instead. Anthony Armstrong Jones was 29 when their paths crossed properly in 1958 at a dinner party given by mutual friends. He was the son of a Welsh barrister and a society beauty, Cambridge educated, a working photographer with a studio in Pimlico, and a reputation for technical brilliance and personal charm. He was bisexual, which was an open secret in his circle, and an entirely closed one beyond it. He was small, dark, quick, and not remotely impressed by titles. He photographed Margaret for her 29th birthday portrait. The image is unusually relaxed. By the time it was published, they were already involved. The courtship was conducted with a discretion that astonished those who later learned of it. They met in a small terraced house in Rotherhithe, on the south bank of the Thames, owned by his friends William and Susan Glenton. She would arrive after dark, sometimes driving herself. For a princess whose every public movement was tracked, the secrecy held for the better part of 2 years. The engagement was announced in February 1960. The wider royal household, including her sister, learned of it only days before the public did. They were married at Westminster Abbey on the 6th of May 1960. It was the first royal wedding to be broadcast on television, and an estimated 300 million people around the world watched it. The bride wore a dress of silk organza designed by Norman Hartnell, severe and modern in line, and the groom wore mourning dress and looked, in the surviving footage, faintly amused. He was created Earl of Snowdon the following year, in time for the birth of their son. Among the wedding gifts was one that would shape the rest of her life. Colin Tennant, later Lord Glenconner, an eccentric Scottish landowner and friend of Margaret since girlhood, presented her with 10 acres of land on a small, undeveloped island in the Grenadines called Mustique. She would, over the next decade, build there a white villa designed by Oliver Messel, her husband's uncle, and name it Les Jolies Hauts. At the time of the wedding, it was a gesture. Within 15 years, it would be a stage. David, Viscount Linley, was born in 1961. Lady Sarah Armstrong Jones followed in 1964. For a brief period in the early 60s, the Snowdons were the most photographed couple in Europe, the glamorous, modern face of a monarchy that had been looking, since the death of George VI, distinctly grey. Cecil Beaton took the portraits. Peter Sellers, Rudolf Nureyev, Mick Jagger, and a rotating company of writers and designers came to dinner at Kensington Palace. Noel Coward, whose diaries are one of the most reliable contemporary records of her social life, recorded long, witty, increasingly tired evenings with the princess and her husband. The marriage curdled faster than the public knew. Both Snowdons were unfaithful, by every credible account, with something approaching competitive energy. He was often abroad on assignment for the Sunday Times magazine. She drank steadily, smoked heavily, kept guests until 3 in the morning, and grew thinner and sharper as the decade wore on. By 1967, the couple were leading effectively separate lives under one roof. By 1972, they were leading separate lives in separate places, and one of those places, increasingly, was a white villa above turquoise water, where the princess sat alone for weeks at a time, with a drink and a view, and a marriage that existed only on paper and in the court circular. Mustique, by 1972, sits in the imagination like a postcard from a life that has detached from its moorings. The white villa above turquoise water, Margaret alone there for weeks at a time, Tony in London with his own life, the marriage existing only on paper and in the court circular. Colin Tennant, who had given her the land as a wedding present 12 years earlier, presides over the island like an indulgent host who has noticed his most famous guest is no longer leaving. She is 42. She has been a public figure for 36 of those years. The villa Les Jolies Hauts has 4 bedrooms, a staff, a view that flattens the mind, and almost no requirement that she behave like a princess of the United Kingdom while she is inside it. It is at one of Tennant's house parties, in the late summer of 1973, that she meets Roddy Llewellyn. He is 25, she is 43. He is the son of Sir Harry Llewellyn, the Olympic show jumper who won gold at Helsinki in 1952. He is a landscape gardener by trade, vague by temperament, gentle in a way that the men in her life so far have largely not been. The introduction is engineered. Tennant, watching Margaret slide further into the brittle isolation of a failing marriage, has decided she needs distraction, and he has chosen the distraction with care. Within days of the introduction, they are a couple. By winter, she has brought Roddy to Mustique. The texture of the affair matters, because the public version that would harden around it later was a caricature. He is not a fortune hunter, and she is not a predator. They are, in their way, well matched in unhappiness. He drifts, she drinks. Both want intermittently to be looked after. They are photographed together at airports and on beaches and make almost no effort to deny what is obvious. She buys him plants for the garden centre he is trying to start. She invites him to Kensington Palace. He is absorbed, awkwardly, into a household that does not know what to do with him and largely pretends he is not there. In the summer of 1974, Roddy has what would now be called a breakdown. He disappears to Turkey without telling her. Margaret, left in London, takes an overdose of Mogadon. The household line, repeated to anyone who asked, was that she had needed to sleep for a week. The meaning was unmistakable to those around her. She recovered, the matter was not spoken of again in public, and within months Roddy was back, and the relationship resumed as if nothing had happened. Both of them, in their separate ways, were quietly drowning, and the press had not yet decided what to do with the story. That decision was made on the morning of February 19th, 1976. The News of the World ran a photograph across its front page that has, more than any other single image, fixed Princess Margaret in the British memory. She is in a beach caftan at a picnic table on Mustique. Roddy is beside her, bare-chested, 28 years old, looking exactly like what he was, a young man on holiday with a woman 17 years older than him who happened to be the Queen's sister. By any modern standard, the picture is innocuous. In February 1976, it was a detonation. The country into which it landed was not in a forgiving mood. Inflation had been above 20% the previous year. The pound was sliding. Within months, the Labour government would be negotiating an emergency loan from the International Monetary Fund. In that atmosphere, a photograph of a civil list princess sunbathing in the Caribbean with a man young enough to be her son was not a society item. It was a political problem. Willie Hamilton, the Labour MP for West Fife, who had spent a decade calling the royal family expensive and useless, stood up in the Commons and called Margaret a royal parasite. He demanded her removal from the civil list. The tabloids ran the cost of her Mustique holidays in columns beside the wages of nurses and miners. The arithmetic was unflattering, and the timing was worse. Lord Snowdon, by every account that survives, was furious, and his fury reached the papers through friends with practiced efficiency. He had conducted his own affairs for years with the discretion the system rewarded. Margaret had been photographed. The distinction in 1976 was the whole game. The separation was announced on March 19th, 3 weeks after the picture ran. The statement was brief, and the briefing around it was not. For the first time in the modern era, a senior royal marriage had ended in public, on the front pages, with a named third party and a photograph to anchor the story. Divorce was finalised on July 11th, 1978, the first divorce of a senior member of the royal family in modern times. The Queen's response, relayed through silence, was a sympathy so cold it was almost indistinguishable from displeasure. Nothing was said in public, nothing needed to be. Roddy stayed for a few years more, and then, in 1981, married someone else. Margaret cried at the wedding, and the detail, repeated in every subsequent profile, became a kind of shorthand for the whole shape of her life. The men she wanted, she could not keep. The men she could keep, she did not want. By the early 80s, she was 50, divorced, the subject of 1,000 jokes she could not answer, and still, formally, a working princess of the United Kingdom. She continued, patron of more than 80 organisations, Councillor of State when the Queen was abroad, regular engagements, openings, charity galas, the steady drip of public duty that the family expected and she, despite everything, almost never refused. But the image had set, and it would not be moved. She became, in the public mind, the rude princess, the difficult princess, the one who kept guests standing at dinner because nobody could sit while she stood, and she would not sit until she had finished her cigarette. The anecdotes hardened into legend, some true, some embellished, some invented entirely. The snubbing of Princess Anne, the curt note to Elizabeth Taylor, the insistence on famous grouse whiskey at every house she visited, in a specific glass, at a specific temperature. The protocol enforced ruthlessly at private dinners by a woman who had spent her life being told that protocol was the price of being interesting. Friends who had known her longest said both halves of it were true. The rudeness was real, so was the loneliness behind it. Noel Coward had recorded as much in his diaries a decade earlier, watching her across a lunch table and noting the exhausted wit and the small cruelties and the genuine, unanswered warmth underneath. The body, meanwhile, began to send its bills. She had smoked since she was 15, at the reported rate of 60 cigarettes a day. In January 1985, part of her left lung was removed, the operation conducted with the same surgeon and in the same hospital as her father's lung surgery 34 years earlier. The parallel was not lost on her. She contracted hepatitis. She suffered a first stroke in February 1998 while staying on Mustique, and the island that had been her refuge became, almost overnight, somewhere she could no longer comfortably reach. In early 1999, she stepped into a bath at Les Joliot without realizing the water was scalding. The nerve damage from the stroke meant she could not feel her feet. The burns were severe. She was never fully mobile again. By 2001, she was in a wheelchair, wearing dark glasses, her face changed almost beyond recognition by stroke and steroid and the simple accumulation of 70 hard years. That last public photograph at Royal Lodge, August 2001. Margaret in dark glasses behind her mother and sister, her face turned slightly away from the camera, 6 months from death. That last public photograph at Royal Lodge, August 2001. Margaret in dark glasses behind her mother and sister, her face turned slightly away from the camera, 6 months from death. She is 71 and looks older. The hand resting on the arm of the chair belongs to a woman who has stopped pretending. 6 months later, on February 9, 2002, at King Edward VII's Hospital, after a further stroke, Princess Margaret Rose, Countess of Snowdon, died. The funeral, at her own request, was private. She was cremated, unusual for a senior royal, and her ashes were placed in the King George VI Memorial Chapel at Windsor, beside her father. There was a logic to it she had probably arranged in her own mind years earlier. The man who had called her his joy, the only one of them perhaps who had ever told her yes without conditions. 7 weeks later, on March 30th, 2002, the Queen Mother died, aged 101. The mother outlived the daughter she had perhaps loved least, wisely. Step back from the funeral arrangements and look at the shape of the life. The argument the evidence supports is this: Margaret was not destroyed by her enemies. She had no enemies of any real consequence. She was destroyed by the gap between what she was allowed to want and what she was allowed to have. In October 1955, at 25, the system told her in measured language that she could not marry the man she loved. She obeyed. She wrote the statement in her own hand and read it to the Commonwealth. And from that morning forward, she never trusted the system again, and she never built a private life that could survive the publicity she had courted to fill the silence the system had left behind. The counter-argument deserves a fair hearing. She had every advantage the 20th century could give a woman and squandered most of them. She was cruel to staff who could not answer back. She was capricious with friends who had crossed continents to amuse her. She was expensive to the taxpayer in a decade when the taxpayer was counting. Her unhappiness was at least partly self-inflicted, and the people who paid for it were not always the ones who had caused it. Both readings are true. Adult lives usually contain both. The honest verdict on Margaret is that she was indulged into helplessness and then judged as if she had been raised free. Place her now in the line. She is the first member of the modern royal family to live an essentially modern celebrity life, and she did it without the template that her niece by marriage, Diana, would inherit from her 20 years later. Margaret made the mistakes first, in public, with no playbook, no press office worth the name, no sympathetic biography in the bookshops, no precedent to point at and say, it was survived before, it can be survived again. Every senior royal divorce that followed, Princess Anne in 1992, the Duke of York in 1996, the then Prince of Wales the same year, walked through a door that Margaret had been the first to force open in July 1978. The church did not collapse. The crown did not fall. The country adjusted. It adjusted because Margaret had already absorbed the shock of being first, and the institution had quietly learned, by watching her, what it could survive. If the gap between royal image and royal reality is the thread that interests you, that is the work that continues on this channel. And subscribing to Queen Toby EN is what keeps these long stories arriving in your feed. Return now to the image we opened on. The News of the World, February 19th, 1976. A grainy front page. A 45-year-old woman in a swimsuit on a beach she had been given as a wedding present from a marriage that no longer existed in any real sense, sitting beside a man 17 years her junior, whom she would lose within 5 years, photographed by a press she had genuinely believed she could manage, because she had been managing photographers since she was 6 years old. Every element of her undoing is in that single frame. The island, the gift of a marriage that failed. The man, the proof that she had stopped waiting for permission. The swimsuit, the small, ordinary detail that the country would not forgive her for. And the camera itself, the thing she had been raised in front of, turning, finally, into the instrument of her exposure. She had been told, at 25 years old, on a specific morning in October 1955, by people whose names are now footnotes, that duty came before love. She spent the next 46 years proving that she had heard the lesson and rejected it. Townsend, Armstrong-Jones, Llewellyn, Mustique, the whiskey, the cigarettes, the late nights at Kensington Palace. The staff kept standing, the friends kept waiting, the sister kept at the polite distance of state occasions. All of it, read at the right angle, is one long argument, with a decision she had been forced to make before she was old enough to know what she was giving away. And the cost of that argument, measured in marriages dissolved, lungs surrendered, friendships exhausted, mornings lost to the bottle, and evenings to the telephone, turned out to be almost exactly the cost the system had warned her about in 1955. They had told her she would lose her rank, her income, her place. She kept all three and lost everything else instead. She lived as if she had nothing to lose, because, on a Monday morning in October 1955, in a statement she wrote herself, she had already lost it. The urn was placed in the King George VI Memorial Chapel at Windsor, beside the father who had called her his joy, 66 years after he became king by accident and made her, against her will and without her consent, into a princess with nowhere in the world to go.